Hi, welcome to an online lecture looking at the third and final step of the absorption costing process, which is to absorb the indirect costs into cost units. I'm Gareth and I hope you're very well. Well, hopefully you've already worked through the first two steps of absorption costing. Step one is where we allocate and apportion our overheads to the various cost centres in our business. So we'll apportion rent perhaps on the basis of floor space. The second step is to then take any overheads that are in service cost centres and to reapportion them into the production cost centres. And we've got two approaches to doing that, the direct method and the step down method. This third step is now, once we've reapportioned the indirect costs out of the service cost centres, it should mean that all of our overheads are gathered into just the production cost centres. Remember, the production cost centres are the departments that actual physical units of production flow through. So what we now need to do is absorb these overheads, these indirect costs, into the cost units by basically spreading the overhead across the level of production. Remember, the ultimate purpose of costing is to identify a cost per unit. We're effectively drawing up a cost card. We need to identify how much overhead relates to a single unit. So for instance, if the polishing department had £80,000 of overhead costs and has dealt with 40,000 units in the period, well, if I spread £80,000 over 40,000 units, that's £2 per unit. That £2 per unit would be what I might put into the cost card. In fact, this £2 per unit is what's often referred to as an overhead absorption rate, because it's the rate at which each unit is absorbing elements of overhead, sometimes abbreviated to an OAR. And in fact, the formula that we use to calculate the OAR is we take the overhead costs, so maybe the 80,000, and we divide by the basis of activity, maybe the 40,000 units, to give us the £2 per unit. Now, in that little illustration, we've just worked out an OAR per unit. That £2 was per unit because we used the number of units as the basis for activity. We divided the 80,000 by 40,000 units. It's worth being aware that's not the only basis that we can use. There are three typical bases that you might come across. There's per unit, as we've just shown, where we divided the £80,000 by 40,000 units produced. We could also look at per labour hour or per machine hour. Now, all it affects is what we're dividing the 80,000 by. We either divide it by the number of labour hours or by the number of machine hours. So for instance, if we wanted to use a labour hour basis to calculate the OAR, well, we take the £80,000 and we divide by the number of labour hours. So if there had been 16,000 labour hours worked in the period, the OAR would just be the overhead cost of 80,000. This time the basis of activity is the number of hours worked, and if you divide £80,000 by 16,000 hours, that's £5 per labour hour. And notice we're expressing that in a different way. The £2 was per unit, the £5 is per labour hour. We could equally do it on a machine hour basis if we thought that was more appropriate. We would just divide the £80,000 by the number of machine hours, and that would give a rate per machine hour. So you've got to be very careful what you're calculating the OAR per. Is it per unit? Is it per labour hour? Is it per machine hour? So I sound a bit like a cat, don't I? All this purring. Now, in terms of lecture example 4, let's just have a think about when we would use each of these bases for calculating an OAR. When would I use per unit? When would I use per labour hour? When would I use per machine hour? Bearing in mind that all it changes is what I'm dividing the overhead cost by. All it changes is what I'd be dividing the 80,000 by. Am I dividing by 40,000 units? Am I dividing by 16,000 labour hours? Or am I dividing by the number of machine hours? Well, to use per unit, when would that be appropriate? Well, per unit is appropriate if every unit is identical. So in our example above, if every single one of those 40,000 units was exactly the same, it would seem reasonable to give each of them the same amount of overhead. It would seem reasonable to give each of them a £2 overhead cost because they're all identical. So per unit is used if every single unit you produce is identical. If they're not identical, so imagine that 40,000 units was actually 20,000 small units and 20,000 very big units. Now that's still 40,000 in total, but it seems less meaningful and less sensible if some of them are small and some of them are big to give each of them the same £2. So if the units differ, we might use per labour hour or per machine hour. So this is if we've got different types of units being made, maybe small units and big units. Well, in this case, why would I use per labour hour? Well, this is if there's different units being made and production is labour intensive. Now, labour intensive means that the units are handmade. So if in our example we did make 20,000 little units and 20,000 big units and they were handmade, I might do it on a labour hour basis, because the bigger units will probably take longer to make. They will use more labour hours, so the big units would therefore get a higher share of the overhead. If a big unit took 2 hours to make and a little unit took 1 hour to make, well, based on my £5 per labour hour, a big unit at 2 hours would absorb £10 of overhead, whereas a small unit for 1 hour would only absorb £5 of overhead. So by using a labour hour basis, it would seem reasonable to put a higher overhead to units that take longer. Well, per labour hour is if production is labour intensive, per machine hour is if production is capital intensive, or what's sometimes referred to as automated, we do production with machinery rather than it being handmade. So if we had again our 20,000 little units and 20,000 big units, but they were all machine produced without much intervention from staff, and you can imagine that in this day and age an awful lot of production is done with machinery. A lot of manufacturing environments are capital intensive. I'd probably be inclined to use the per machine hour basis to work out my OAR.